Chapter 38. A disappointing promotion. "Okay, darling, you're next," spoke the Inquisitor, standing right in front of Reyes. The mage also tapped him gently on the shoulder with the iron shoe of his staff to make it clear who he was talking to. Reyes stepped forward nervously. He began to get seriously worried about his sword and his bracelets. If he had left them in the barracks this morning, then neither item would have been an issue, but he didn't like to leave his sword in a place where just anyone could pick it up. As the corpse of Quillig attested, the penalty for theft was quite severe, but first the thief had to get caught. Also, Reyes had used his bracelets in the hunt that morning, and he hadn't had an opportunity to hide them in the barracks since, even if he had been of a mind to do so. Although the mage was clearly fascinated by the items Reyes was carrying, he acted totally professional. He didn't allow either of the items to distract his attention, and instead looked Reyes in the eyes as he said, "Right then, sweetie, take off your skirt and belt." Reyes felt a little uncomfortable as he undid the clasp that held his skirt up. It wasn't the nudity that bothered him as much as the scrutiny that the mage seemed to be subjecting him to. Perhaps if the mage wouldn't keep calling him darling and sweetie, he wouldn't feel quite so uncomfortable. As it was, he couldn't resist glancing round to make sure that Gaggara was all right. Gaggara was fine. She was standing just behind him with her head tilted slightly to one side and a slight smile on her face. She looked as if she was enjoying the show. Turning back to face the mage, Reyes let his skirt fall to the ground. He then got to work on the clasp that held his belt in place. "You're male," the mage blurted out in surprise. Reyes was almost tempted to make some sort of sarcastic comment, but somehow he didn't feel comfortable joking with one of the Inquisitors. Instead, he simply said, "I am." He pulled the sword free of the belt and let the belt itself drop harmlessly to the ground. The mage was shaking his head in disbelief. "I have to admit, I'm surprised to see a male harpy amongst the ranks of the Hope. I thought you guys spent all your time in a large hut in the centre of your village, mating your way gradually through anything female. Sisters, aunts, your own mother and grandmother, even next door's prize poodle." Reyes wasn't sure whether to be amused or offended. He would have to admit that many people, even harpies themselves, seemed to think that the entire purpose of a male was to propagate the species. The mage continued, "This is the 12th branch of the Hope that I've checked today, and you are the first male harpy I've met. You're also the first harpy I've seen with so much as a magical toothpick. I can't help thinking that the two things must be related in some way." Reyes hesitated to comment. He would have to admit he was actually scared. He bowed his head gently as if nodding, but couldn't bring himself to speak. "Right," the mage commented. "Let's get started." The mage tucked his staff under his shoulder and then rubbed his hands together as if in gleeful anticipation. Reyes recognized what he was doing. He was using friction to summon magical energy into his very being. The mage then grabbed the handle of his staff and used it to draw a couple of mystical symbols in the air, while at the same time he traced identical symbols over Reyes' body. Reyes didn't recognize the spell. He couldn't help thinking that at least half of the motions the mage had gone through were purely for show. But Reyes had felt the magic enter his body as the mage had traced the symbols on his chest, and it scared him. "I'll check your bracelet thingies first," the mage said, pointing to the two bracelets that Reyes was wearing. "Are they real silver?" Reyes hesitated to answer. Should he admit that these bracelets were made of silver and might therefore be worth even more than they would be for just being magical? Then again, Reyes wasn't sure he knew. He had always assumed that they were made of silver because they looked like they were made of silver, but he had never had a metallurgical analysis done of them. The mage seemed to read Reyes' hesitation as an intent to lie. "I feel I should warn you that the spell I just cast on you will detect any untruth you speak. As long as you tell me the truth, you will have absolutely nothing to worry about. However, should I even begin to suspect that you are lying to me for any reason whatsoever..." The mage paused. "Well, let's just say they don't call us Inquisitors for nothing." Reyes nodded doubtfully. He slid the bracelets from his arms and handed them to the mage. As he did so, he couldn't help wondering if it would be the last he would ever see of them. "So," the mage asked, taking the bracelets, "are they silver?" "I don't know," Reyes replied. "I've always thought they were, but I honestly don't know." "Fair enough," the mage said as he nodded his acceptance of the answer. He moved the bracelets from one hand to the other as if trying to get a feel for them. Then his questions seemed to head off on a tangent. "So, how old are you?" 7.5, Reyes replied. That was an easy question. Reyes hoped they would all be of that calibre. "I have to ask it. Are you a spy?" "No," Reyes replied defensively. He hoped that answer would register as true. Sir Richmond had asked him to keep an eye out while he was in Goldspawn, and he had been in contact with a human spy and had even told him a few things of interest. Nevertheless, Reyes hadn't come here as a spy. He had come here as an exile, and that was how he tended to think of himself. Besides, he wasn't about to just come out and admit something like that. The mage seemed more than satisfied with the answer. "What's your name?" "Tan," Reyes started, and then he halted. He had gone under the name Tanrag for so long that he was used to answering the question with that name. Perhaps because he had used it for so long the spell would register it as true, but Reyes wasn't sure he could take the chance. He glanced round at Gaggara again. Even she wasn't aware of his true name, and she was the one he loved more than his own life. Gaggara was standing close enough to hear every word that passed between him and the mage. If he told the mage his name was Reyes, then Gaggara would hear. How would she react when she found out that he had been lying to her for all this time? How would the mage react when he admitted to having the same name as the youngest child of the Moth family? "My name is Reyes," he admitted reluctantly. "Reyes," the mage repeated. If there had been any chance that Gaggara hadn't overheard Reyes use the name, it was doubtful she would have missed the mage repeat it. "That doesn't sound like a harpy name." "It isn't," Reyes commented reluctantly, then thinking there might still be a way out of this, a way that he might still save face with his ladylove, he said, "I adopted the name Tanrag once I entered the city." Fortunately, it seemed that the mage had never heard of Reyes the Moth. It was sometimes amazing to Reyes just how few people seemed to be aware that Duke the Moth even had a fourth child. In the past, it had been upsetting to feel that he had been overlooked, but since entering Goldspawn, it had actually proven to be quite an advantage. Reyes had expected the mage to ask a follow-up question, something along the lines of, "So, what sort of name is Reyes?" Instead, he stopped talking for all of a moment as he began to examine one of the bracelets in earnest. Reyes could see the gentle blue glow of magic surrounding the mage's hands as the power was focused there. After what seemed a long time, the mage swapped one of the bracelets for the other and repeated the process. Finally, he looked into Reyes' eyes and said, "I can see why you wanted to become a hunter, rather than just hang about in some village, wasting your life in a hut with whatever girl your leader might happen to have picked for you that day." "Oh?" Reyes commented. "You know what these things do, of course," the mage suggested. Again, Reyes didn't want to answer when he knew that Gaggara was so close and could overhear every word. He glanced nervously back at her and gave her a guilty smile. Ever since he had first fired at one of the practice targets in Harpytown and hit the very centre bullseye with his first shot, she had thought of him as some sort of master with the bow. How would she react when she found out his skill was owed to a magical item? "Yes, I can never miss what I'm aiming at." Reyes could hear someone snort behind him. It didn't really sound like Gaggara snorting, but he had this image of her standing behind him, her fists planted on her waist with her elbows sticking out, peering disapprovingly at his back. He loved Gaggara. He knew he really ought to have told her all these things before now. For all the magical items he had, he knew the one thing he really didn't want to lose was her love. The mage nodded. "They are nice. You could sell these for a small fortune and buy a house somewhere in the rich section of the city." "I'm Harpy," Reyes pointed out, somewhat surprised to hear the mage even suggest that he might be welcome in such a part of the city. The mage laughed. "Believe me, when you have enough money to your name, people won't even notice what race you are. Your neighbours might despise you behind their walls, but they will respect you to your face." I thought that other than those who were members of the Hope, all harpies had to live in the part of the city put aside for us. "Harpytown," Reyes commented. "Money opens doors," the mage replied. The mage looked down at the bracelets and smiled at them, prompting Reyes to think that he planned to keep them. Then the mage surprised Reyes by handing them back. After what he had just said about their value, Reyes was very glad to see them again, and immediately began to refasten the items to his arms, before the mage changed his mind. Next, the mage picked up the belt and checked the pouches. This didn't take too long, as only one of the pouches had anything of interest, although what it did contain prompted the mage to comment, "You have a lot of money for a harpy." "I sold a horse shortly after I got here," Reyes declared. "Since then, I haven't had a lot of call to spend any money. Everything I've needed has always been supplied for me. My housing, my food, and so on. Reyes couldn't resist looking around at Gaggara and giving her a grateful smile. After all, she had been the one who had provided all his food and shelter, as well as being company in the otherwise lonely evenings and warmth during the icy cold of winter. Gaggara tilted her head slightly to the side, as if wondering why Reyes was smiling at her. There was a sense of coldness about her. Right there and then he wanted to take her in his arms and tell her how much he loved her, how much he appreciated her being there for him. Instead, Reyes turned his attention back to the mage and watched as the elf closed the pouch and let the belt drop back to the floor. "Fine," the mage said. "Now for the sword and scabbard." Reluctantly, Reyes handed the sword to the mage. He then bent down and picked up the belt. Once he had put it back on, he looked down at the skirt where he had let it fall. The mage was busy looking along the length of the scabbard. He seemed to be totally enamoured by the beauty of the thing. Very nice. Very ornate. I think these gems are real. If you were to remove just one of these gems, you could probably set yourself up for life. "I doubt they're worth that much," Reyes commented. He knew his father wasn't poor, but neither was he really all that well off. Yes, they were nice gemstones, but he doubted a lot were worth much more than 1,000 or 2 crore. "No," the mage insisted, disagreeing. "This stone here," he pointed to a green stone located on the tip of the scabbard, "is called a floronite. It's so called because the only known location it can be found in on this continent is in the human kingdom of Floreth. Even there, it's found on only one small island, a place called Arlis. This stone is extremely rare outside of that country's borders, and as a result is considered very valuable. What is more, I count no less than 7 of these stones decorating this scabbard, as well as a pair of black netronite stones on the hilt." "Netronite?" Reyes asked. "Not quite as valuable, but still fairly rare," the mage declared. "I would almost say that this sword had to be a flourish manufacture." Reyes nodded, but resisted the urge to comment on the sword. Instead, he pointed at his skirt and said, "May I?" The mage glanced at what Reyes was pointing at and said, "Oh, sure, go ahead." Reyes pulled up the skirt and refastened the clasp to hold it in place. "This sword is very light," the mage was saying. He turned it slowly in his hands. "It makes me wonder if the hilt is just for display." "It's a real sword," Reyes commented. "Really?" The mage unsheathed the sword. The sudden weight of the blade struck the mage with surprise, and he almost dropped the weapon. "The scabbard lightens the weight of the blade," Reyes explained. "Indeed. I should have checked it first," the mage commented. "Is that all it does? There seems to be something special about the blade as well." Reyes considered telling the mage what the sword did, but he felt it best to keep quiet. The spell that was on him couldn't catch him in a lie if he didn't say anything, and he wasn't sure how he would explain to the mage why he knew what he did about the sword. In the end, Reyes replied, "You tell me." The mage looked up at Reyes. He let the scabbard drop to the ground, tucked his staff back under his arm again, and rested the sword blade gently on the palms of his hands. A few seconds later, he was channeling magic through the sword, and a moment after that, he was dropping the sword, as if he had just been bitten by it. "Are you all right?" Reyes asked, concerned. "I'm fine." The mage picked the sword and scabbard back up and returned the blade to its sheath. "I just wasn't ready for so much power." "Power?" Reyes commented. The mage nodded. "You know, if a harpy was able to wield a sword, and I'm sure there are a few out there that can, then I almost believe that this scabbard could have been made especially for her. The way it lightens the weight of a sword would be a great boon to someone who flies." Reyes began to feel a little worried. "However, the design of the scabbard is flourish. The only harpies in Floreth are kept in tiny cages in circuses. No flourish mage would ever consider making a weapon for a harpy." Reyes nodded, feigning interest. The mage continued, "Then there's the blade. The scabbard and blade were clearly designed together. They were made for each other. They're a match. And yet, as I just found out to my shock, the blade focuses magical energy in much the same way as a mage's staff does. This clearly is not the weapon of a harpy. Well, I suppose if you believe in the tales of Lamawalt the Eternal, it could be her sword." "Lamawalt? Really?" Reyes commented, taken by surprise. "The Eternal," the mage repeated. "Yes, although it seems unlikely that she would have had access to Floronite." "So, I have to ask," the mage said as he tucked the sword under his arm and took hold of his staff by the handle. "Where did you get it?" Reyes began to get the distinct feeling that he wasn't going to get the sword back. He was so worried about his sword that he all but missed the question the Major asked him. What? Sorry? Where did you get the sword? The Major repeated. He sounded a little irritated at having to repeat himself. Reyes was tempted to say that he found it. He was tempted to say anything other than to admit the truth that he had taken it from a castle in Clorif. Then it occurred to him that he was still under the influence of a lie detection spell, and anything but the truth would only lead him into hot water. Reyes almost said, I stole it from Castle de Moff. But even that would have been a lie. He hadn't stolen it. The sword had been given to him. He realised that he had to choose his words very carefully, and even then the mage might decide that Reyes wasn't to be trusted. I got it from a family in Florif. Really? The mage commented. He seemed quite interested, which only served to worry Reyes even more. You've been to Florif, then? I have, Reyes admitted hesitantly. Again he worried that Gaggara may have overheard the claim. Then again, he vaguely remembered telling her that he had come from Florif. The elf nodded sagely. You were held prisoner at one of the circuses? I wasn't at a circus, no, Reyes replied. He decided it best not to correct the mage's misconception that he'd been a prisoner, though. After all, what other type of harpy would be living in Florif? Where, then? The mage asked. I was... Reyes hesitated as he thought about the best way to put it without actually lying. A guest of the de Moff family at their castle. Indeed, the mage commented. Then he swapped quickly into fluent flourish. Tell me, do you speak flourish at all? I do, Reyes admitted before he even realised they had switched languages. He added, I believe myself to be quite fluent. He cleared his throat. For some reason it was beginning to feel very dry. Until you escaped, the mage asked. Until I escaped, Reyes echoed without thinking. That was a true statement, though, Reyes realised with relief after he had said it. The king had been about to execute him, and he had escaped. The elf laughed and reverted to Elistran. Very good. We have a lot of soldiers in the city. It would be good if each regiment had at least one soldier who could speak flourish, so that we'll be able to communicate with the enemy when we invade. You're likely to prove quite an asset for your regiment in the upcoming invasion. Thank you, Reyes said. So, tell me, how long were you at the castle? The mage seemed to have suddenly adopted a tone that made Reyes feel as if he and the mage could be lounging in comfortable chairs and chatting about old times. Reyes didn't trust the mage. He was certain that the Inquisitor was trying to lull him into a false sense of security. He couldn't forget that although the mage seemed to be treating Reyes almost as an old friend, he had yet to return the sword. I'm not really sure. A long time, though. Most of my life, I would say. The mage nodded. So before you escaped, you knew little else? I remember nothing from before my... Reyes hesitated to use the word captivity. Fortunately, the mage seemed to assume the word. It might have been that he thought Reyes just wasn't able to talk about it. It must have been hell for you there. How well did you get to know the castle while you were there? Did they let you wander around relatively free? Or were you stuck in one small room most of the time? Reyes closed his eyes worriedly. Somehow he felt certain that he was walking into a trap. I couldn't fly, so I was pretty much given the run of the castle. The mage nodded. Supposing I asked you to give me a tour of the place, could you do it? If I had to, Reyes replied. Follow me then, the mage said. What? Reyes explained. He hadn't expected to be taken anywhere, and he began to worry that he must have failed the test. Follow me, the mage repeated. Then he led the way across the drill ground towards the commanding officer of the Inquisitors. The two shield-bearers turned with military precision. They followed close on the heels of their mage. Reyes glanced quickly at Gaggara, a worried expression on his face. Then he followed in the wake of the Inquisitor, feeling as if he was walking to his doom. Now that he was this close, Reyes could actually see the rank of the commanding officer of the Inquisitors. He wore the same symbol on his badge as Dragonman Fanfare did, suggesting that he too held the rank of Dragonman. But there was something else, an extra little symbol that Fanfare didn't have. Reyes had no idea what the symbol meant, but it was clear that because of it, he outranked the Hope's officer. Other than his two shield-bearers, standing with this Dragonman superior were the two commanding officers of the 421st Hope, Dragonman Fanfare and his ever-attentive assistant, Wormman Frayne. Neither of them seemed too happy to see Reyes cross the drill ground towards them. At the feet of these three officers were the dead bodies of the 12 humans that had been called out of the ranks of the Hope for their loyalty tests. As he reached the officers, Reyes had a hard time taking his eyes away from the corpses. By the look of it, the majority of them had been impaled on their own swords. Just what had this Dragonman Superior done to them? "Who is this?" Dragonman Finert spoke first. "Did you catch a spy?" The Inquisitor Mage ignored the comment from Dragonman Finert totally. Instead, he approached his own commanding officer and offered a quick salute before delivering his report. "This harpy is able to speak fluent Flourish. He could prove to be quite an asset in the war to come. He also says he has intimate knowledge of the layout of Castle Damoth." "You're sure about this?" the Dragonman Superior asked. "I had a detect lie spell on him all the time, and we even exchanged a few sentences in the Flourish language." "Good work," the Dragonman Superior commented. He turned his attention to Reyes and then waved his hands randomly, finishing with touching his lips with the index finger of his right hand. "So, how fluent are you?" Again, Reyes didn't recognize the spell that had been cast, but he assumed that the Dragonman Superior wasn't a natural Flourish speaker and was having to use magic to enhance his ability. "Fluent enough, I suppose." The Dragonman Superior smiled. "Good. Ask me something in Flourish. Show me your language skills." Reyes nodded. He indicated the human corpses and asked, "What happened to them?" "Excellent, excellent," the Dragonman Superior commented happily. "Say something else." Reyes looked at the dead bodies and back at the officer. He didn't want to repeat the question. It might be considered insubordinate. Yet, some of those humans had been his friends. "Did you kill them?" The Dragonman Superior seemed to realize. "Oh, you seriously want to know? Well, don't you worry about it. They passed the loyalty test is all." "So you killed them?" Reyes asked. Even as he said it, he regretted it. But what if they tried to test his loyalty the same way? "No, no," the Dragonman Superior responded. "They killed themselves. That was the test. Then, either tiring of conversing in Flourish, or maybe because the spell had worn off, he returned to Alistran. Well, you certainly seem to be fluent enough." "Yes, my lord," the mage commented. "He could indeed prove useful," the Dragonman Superior uttered. "Yes, my lord," the mage repeated. He then handed Reyes' sword over to his commanding officer. He was armed with this little toy. "I thought you might find a use for it. I'm pretty sure those are Floronite gems in the scabbard." "Floronite?" the Dragonman Superior commented. "Really?" That was it, Reyes thought to himself, his eyes transfixed on the blade as the Dragonman Superior examined it. He had held the weapon for about a year now. Admittedly, he hadn't seen a lot of action in that year, but it had been like an old friend. There was nothing he could do. The Inquisitor was just too powerful, both in magic and in authority. Reyes could try to grab the weapon and fly away, but he doubted he would get very far, and besides, just where would he go? "Very nice," the Dragonman Superior commented. "This is the sort of sword I imagine that Llama would have used." "That was what I said," the mage replied. The Dragonman Superior nodded and smiled. "It's a lovely sword. Looks too new to be a relic of her era, though. Nevertheless, it would certainly be of most use in the hands of a harpy that could wield magic." "It's a shame there is no such thing," the mage commented. "Absolutely," the Dragonman Superior agreed. "As it is, this sword is pretty much useless to me. I suppose I could grab the gems, but that might devalue the thing as a whole. Perhaps the Dragon Emperor's mage advisor, Darty, may the gods of death and hate watch over him, can find a use for it. I wouldn't be surprised if he had some knowledge of how to use a sword." He tucked the sword under his shoulder, where it promptly vanished from sight, as if the Dragonman Superior had tucked it away in another non-existent pocket. "I'll ask him if I get a chance later." The Dragonman Superior then turned his attention away from Reyes and the mage, and asked Dragonman Finert, "You don't have an interpreter yet, do you?" "We're a Hope Regiment," Finert responded, his eyes flicking to Reyes and to the Inquisitor. "I have little need of an interpreter, and even if I did need one, I wouldn't want a harpy. Second Book of Emerald, Canto 9, Line 6, for ye shall not allow the lesser races to think of themselves as your equal." "As your equal," Wormman Frayne echoed. "This harpy speaks fluent Flourish, and you will use him," the Dragonman Superior insisted. He glanced briefly at Wormman Frayne and then added, "That is an order." Finert sighed. "Very well. Book of Oppression, Canto 14, Line 74, and ye shall take what advantages ye can." "Ye can," Wormman Frayne commented. "Good." The Dragonman Superior sounded a little gruff, and it was clear that he wasn't used to being argued with. I'm glad that's settled. Now, I think the normal rank for a good interpreter is Drakeman, so I'm going to order that he be raised to that rank immediately. Reyes looked up in surprise. As he understood it, the highest rank a non-elf could have in the Hope was that of Chargeman, Chargeman being only one step above the nondescript rank of Recruit, or Grunt, as it was sometimes termed by soldiers themselves. As Reyes reckoned it, Chargeman fell somewhere between the ranks of Corporal and Sergeant as human ranks went. Drakeman was a much higher rank. True, it was the lowest of the real officer ranks, roughly equivalent to a lieutenant in human terms, but it was still a proper officer rank, and would entitle him to all the perks that went with being an officer, including a decent bed in a small, private room where he and Gaggara could liaise at will without having the rest of the regiment know about it. It wouldn't make up for the loss of his sword, but it would be a nice consolation. It seemed that Dragonman Fanert was thinking something along the same lines. Maybe elven interpreters are worth the rank of Drakeman, but this is a harpy, and this is the Hope. The highest rank I'm willing to allow him would be that of Chargeman. Second Book of Emperor, Canto 9, Line 7. Ensure they know their place. Know their place, Wormmanfrain stated. Shut up! The Dragonman Superior shouted at Wormmanfrain. He took a couple of steps menacingly towards him. Don't you realise how irritating that is? If I hear one more word out of you, you're going to regret it for the rest of what will be a very short life. Reyes saw Wormmanfrain cower under the barrage of words from the Inquisitor. Then the Dragonman Superior returned to where Reyes was standing, and for a moment Reyes thought that the Dragonman Superior might follow up his tirade against Frayne by insisting that Reyes be given the rank of Drakeman. Instead, he turned to face Reyes and said somewhat disappointingly, I hereby promote you to the rank of Chargeman. Your responsibilities are to act as interpreter for the officer of the 421st Hope, regardless of who he might be. The Dragonman Superior then glanced meaningfully at the Hope's commanding officer. During the heat of battle, it will be your task to stay by his side at all times, unless he expressly orders you otherwise. Thank you, Reyes commented. Chargeman wasn't a bad promotion. He would have much preferred Drakeman with his own private room, but he would settle for Chargeman. Agnart was a Chargeman, and it wasn't like rank was really all that important to him. In a way, he was just happy to get through this inspection without being arrested as a spy. The increase in rank in no way made up for the loss of his sword, but perhaps that too was for the best. The sword had been little more than trouble since he had gotten it. More than one fight had started because someone had taken a fancy to it, and it would only have been a matter of time until some officer took a fancy to it and claimed it as his own. He felt he ought to be glad that at least he hadn't lost the bracelets as well. The poor devils lying at the feet of the Dragonman Superior had lost their lives.